on the one hand, that we can see a lot of things and build a kind of have come to some kind of pattern understanding of social behavior. But at the same time, I also often work with the assumption that social behaviors are pattern, but sometimes they break patterns. And then how does one think about that? I guess that enables me to have a more rich understanding of social agents, if I may put it that way.
This is Southeast Asia from the ground up. I'm here with Dr. Nick Chan. How are you, Nick?
Good. Great to be here.
Nick is Asian Security Fellow at Strategic and Defense Studies Center at ANU. And I'm quite excited to talk to you today, Nick. And one thing that I was thinking about that we can focus on is just this experience of having been in the field and returning home and making sense this universe amount of data, right? What to do with them, right? So I would like to kind of focus our discussion and conversations today on that topic of meditation as in reflections, right? This scholarly reflection. For me, when I was thinking about reflection, when I was reflecting on reflection, there are at least 4 kind of reflection that I was thinking of. This notion of finding pattern, right? This interconnectedness, this notion of challenging or interventions to establish thoughts, this notion of doubting oneself, and this notion of seeking wisdom, right? And I regard that process of reflection as part and parcel of this scholarly approach. When you return from the field and dealing with or grappling with all the data you've just gathered, what is the first thing you do?
Well, thanks for that question, Emir. I guess one thing I would start with is the premise that we never go to the field empty. We kind of have our readings, we kind of have our own suppositions, although I don't mean that in the presuppositions, I don't mean that in the sense that we're trying to test out theory.
Yeah.
So I think then it becomes a very human process of building something from the ground up. At least that's my approach, right? So, and then it comes by learning that you kind of have to come to terms with this kind of uncomfortable idea that whatever you gain from the field itself alone is not gonna build the kind of output that you're planning. So you kind of have to move between data, move between writings, and also to come to terms that you're coming at it from a very human level, that you have your prior reading, prior knowledge, maybe to some extent prior biases, and then start to see how things can come together on a narrative sense. And that's where it becomes a very storytelling kind of venture, because you're trying to fit things together. I often kind of joke to my friends that writing a thesis or writing a book or whatever, it's like planning a TV season. It's like kind of a season of 8 episodes, start, beginning, and end, and then things have to flow, and then the characters have to be dynamic and all that. So I think it's not very different in that sense, although the point of rigor has to often come in. But then it's also not very different in the sense that the audience often has to be something you bear in mind of. And I find I struggled with that when I was doing my thesis, like who's the audience, who am I speaking to? And I guess TV writers have this problem as well when they're grappling with different genres. So that was my experience, if I may put it that way.
Yeah. I usually just, sit down and get coffee and just reflecting on, okay, I'm overwhelmed. But naturally, we gravitated towards finding pattern and identifying this relationship between pattern, right? I think perhaps, I'm not sure if that's your process as well, but that will be the most natural. And that's why this notion of interconnectedness or interdependence between variable somehow is the first form of reflections, right? And in a way, like if we refer to the philosopher like Baruch Spinoza, that suggests this in his ethics, obviously, through the concept of intellectual love of gods. We don't have to talk about that philosophy, but there is that kind of notion of interconnectedness in everything, right? This unity of mind and body, unity of human and nature. And I felt like in my scholarly process, I tend to also think about, how do actors make sense of their surrounding, their situatedness? And I felt like in your thesis, you identify that kind of complex relationship, right, between something big like Islam and something quite within state level of analysis, this notion of countering violent extremisms, right? So in that sense, in your experience at least, how should we find interconnectedness between variable of different things,
Yeah, I would like to hear about your experience after this as well. Like I think I was juggling with this question of speaking like them and speaking for them.
Okay.
Right. So speaking like them is then you kind of immerse yourself into the life world of these people. Like what are the kind of discursive productions they produce, and how do they make sense of things? And you don't just get that through kind of interviews, you get that through the kind of books and the things they write. Like in my case, religion, you work with fatwas as well. It's like what are the kind of institutional productions of these things, and also try to get to these people at a very human level, not just in interviews. Like if they are kind of open on social media, you can see there's a different kind of presentation of themselves. So trying to kind of first get into the speaking like them, get into that kind of lingo, get into the kind of universe, to know what are the networks they work within. And then you kind of put on then that's kind of wearing the shoes of your informants. And then you kind of put on the hat of the scholar. And this is by no means a comfortable enterprise. Then you try to have to speak for them. So I'm grappling with this idea that how does one wage a kind of war on terror thing in Malaysia as Muslims? And it's not something that comes at least very intuitive to some of the informants, especially when they're speaking to myself as a non-Muslim. So then I have to get to that level of comfort through some rigor that I'm speaking about them and to some extent uncomfortably for them to see how they got caught in this broader thing of the war on terror, if not CVE, which is sort of a very big thing. It has an intergovernmental level to it, and these people are very much immersed in those kind of discursive practices of doing counterterrorism. So it's navigating those questions, like having that kind of immersion that allows you to like, can I speak like them? Not entirely, but I try. And then can I speak for them? Probably not entirely, but I try.
Yeah. That's really interesting. When I was in Malaysia in 2022, I spent 6 months over there, and people like to tell me, you're Indonesians, you don't understand us. And it was kind of bizarre, right? Because in a way, we speak the same roots of Malay language, right? And I am culturally Malay, I'm from Sumatra, but they keep telling me, like, European countries. And I suppose there is that kind of effort from my part as well to because people keep telling me that you won't understand how we think, that it challenges me. I was like, okay, so perhaps the way they think about their environment is slightly different from the way Indonesia think about their environment. And one thing that stuck with me is that notion, obviously in my Malaysia strategic approach article, right? Is that notions of actions reaction. And this theory of, I was like, oh, is that like neo-realist theory? But it's not actually, because they're looking at it from a very like, oh, we are a small state, the region is this web of relationship, and we're gonna get dragged. But then to understand the meaning of it, I have to like keep asking them different questions about the same thing. And I suppose that's where I was just like, oh, okay, because people keep telling me this repeated thing that I don't understand them. I was just trying to kind of like, oh, okay, zoom in to that kind of aspect. I suppose that's kind of like my experience as well. But it was challenging for me to draw a relationship between decision makers and their conduct, right? And how Malaysia see itself in the region, because it's a different kind of unit, and I have that kind of like desire for that. And in a way, your work also have that kind of desire to connect this state level to kind of like a broader, almost universal, if not regional pattern. And do you find that difficult in your process?
Yeah, I mean, I think you get at a very important point, which is sort of what I met when I was doing the counterterrorism research. But it's to navigate different roles played by your informants. Like you mentioned decision makers, but at the same time there are operatives. In counterterrorism, like then there's the minister or the doing this kind of policy planning, and then there's the special branch officer who's doing the day-to-day running stuff. And ultimately, I did find some connections, like sort of what are the kind of broader discursive sphere where it allows the integration between Islam and this security apparatus. Like it becomes a kind of security logic from which they operate. But those things don't come intuitively, because especially when you're kind of meeting with a minister or someone sort of, for the lack of a better term, coming from the elite, there's a level of presentation that was afforded to you that sometimes you feel like there's not much you can gain from that flows to the operational side. I mean, I while I was able to kind of draw those strings in the end, like I was talking to someone from the Ministry of Home Affairs who's working on the day-to-day running on deradicalization programs in this place. Like there are certain things they say about the elites, which are not very pleasant to the ears of the elites. They will say like, yeah, they could write those things, but I don't really follow. Then it's up to your kind of research to basically to draw those connections, and then to challenge yourself. Like if there's no connection, don't force it, right? So I guess it's that kind of, on a very human level, the differentiation, and there's a lot of literature that deals with it, from the state society thing to the more governmentality type stuff, that deals with this. But I guess it does require some level of differentiation in terms of who are you speaking to and what kind of research question are you dealing with, right? That's, I think on the pragmatic level, that's how I think about it.
Yeah, and the other challenging aspect that I found is that quite a lot of these people are in an echo chamber, right? They see the world not necessarily this universe or global world that is so big. They often see their office and their peer and the politics around them. And because of that, a lot of the way they make sense of their environment is very narrow. And when I was in Jakarta a few weeks ago, one of the thing that I'm trying to find is that do they think strategically? Do Indonesian think about their maritime domain in a strategic ways? And a lot of people will tell me, they told me, no, it's all just politics. The procurement of equipment is just corruption and politics, and all this like politics. And then I was like, okay, is that should I just accept that?
Yeah.
Or can I step back and actually find and value judge? No, actually, behind this politics, there's still strategic logic. But doing that almost required me to step back and kind of like, in some part, not ignore, but in some part, just like not trust my informant at face value, but somehow value judge whether there is a strategy behind their thoughts, right?
Yeah.
But in your experience, how do you kind of approach various things people told you?
Right? Yeah, I guess, I think there's always this temptation, I think one sees it in political science, if not even in some kind of area studies literature, that either kind of puts everything down to interest. It's like, there's a lot of things they say, but ultimately, if you can read them from their interests, like what are their group interests, what are their class interests, then they will kind of operate from that. And the other one is that despite all the kind of discursive reasoning that people tend to just make things up as they go along, I cut into this, and I hope I don't annoy you when I keep on using this word, from a very human level thing. And then this not only comes from my doing of the counterterrorism stuff, but also the social media stuff. It's like, when I was looking at those content, I'll tend to think about, okay, how many hours does, like, let's say TikTok. If someone is very immersed in TikTok, then I'll ask myself the questions like, what kind of social environment allows them to consume these things in voracious amount of time? Like, that means that they have the time. That means they have to cut off from their social environment, because it's quite impolite if you keep on watching TikTok without headphones with people around you, unless you are that kind of husband, wife, children, or whatever. And then from there on, you kind of can build the kind of life cycle, if not day-to-day cycle of this person. And then I think that sensibility works for me in terms of dealing with counterterrorism stuff as well. You kind of have to put yourself in the mindset. It's like, how many hours does this person spend on a daily basis doing this, that? Then the kind of floating narratives and the kind of very intuitive discursive reasoning they come to matters, because the thing they consume, ultimately, there's a sense of socialization that goes on. And I feel like the things you're looking for, so-called strategic logic, or at least on a very subconscious level, I think they matter when you kind of time that person out. Like, because one thing about us academics, and I hope we can still keep it, is that when we say we can take a step back, it's like sometimes we have that a little bit of luxury of time to think about these things. When one doesn't, because of the urgencies of the job or the social environment, then the things they consume, the kind of lingo they adopt on a day-to-day basis, I would say that works in the machine to some level, although there's a lot of self-interest, there's a lot of making things up as they go along. I would think that that's still the case. But if you chart out the kind of life world of this particular person or this particular circle of people, then maybe one can say that we get at least a step closer to trying to read those things out from what they tell us and what they didn't tell us. Right?
So in a way, it's almost like a world building.
Yeah, it is.
Because in a way, sure, we are studying a real world thing, right?
Yeah.
We went to the field and we try to study all this and make and approach these people. But then at the end of the day, we can't study everything, and then we have to kind of like focus ourselves in this kind of quite narrow world that is palatable for us in a way, right? And like if I can understand you the way you find pattern is almost like maybe the way I find pattern as well, to kind of like create this processual and almost like reconstruct a different world that is kind of vacuum, right? Creating this vacuum that is observable and therefore can be studied in a way. Is that how you think about just finding this, like approaching your study and finding patterns?
I don't know if I kind of try to seal them in a kind of vacuum, then I get whatever I get from there and try to read it on a clean way. For me, it's more about, and this is where I kind of, this is my point, like, you have you have to come to some kind of level of acceptance that you are coming to this research topic with some prior exposure or prior conceptions. I think maybe having that gives you a more solid footing. Although it doesn't apply in all cases. Like if I have to study the Philippines, then I do not have those kind of solid footing, and I have to start trying, right? So I don't seal them in. It's more like I do the world building before I start approaching them.
Interesting.
And I think these days, thanks to social media, maybe it tells you a bit about myself. Like maybe I spend too much time on these things. Like sometimes, like I think in one cases I find very useful is like I talked to a police officer, and then he told me stuff. And then in one way I tried to get into his world is that I found a video recording of him speaking in a mosque to a kind of audience that's very different from myself, right? It's very local, Malay, Muslim, generally male in that sense. And then I watch how that person kind of operates. And then I think it's very rare you see this separation of the so-called informant in front of you and the informant in front of other people, that they could be completely different person, unless they're trained that way. Maybe if they are politicians, they have that kind of thing that's very intuitive to them. But if you're talking to someone that's a bureaucrat or police officer, you can always see traces of the person in the same person in different environments, and then from there you can kind of read it. But that means you're not boxing the person in, but you're allowing the person to live in their environment and operate. And to some level, I think that's how some of us operate as well. We can never kind of box ourselves. I hope I can, but I can't. Box myself in environments. This is one way I operate, and then the moment I'm done with it, I'm just a different person. Like it's very hard for me. I don't know if that answers your question. What do you think?
I think with Indonesia related research, I can be a bit more intuitive. I don't have to do a lot of world building because, like you said, the world is already kind of like pre-built, right? So there's all that kind of assumption. But the most challenging part of my research was when I was in the Philippines and was in Malaysia, where I had to deconstruct my thoughts that is very Indonesians in a way, you know, like looking at the region from this big country perspective, regional building emphasis, and a lot of these countries focuses quite a lot of, not Indonesia too, but focuses a lot on their self-preservation and issues at hand that Indonesia don't necessarily deal with, for example, right? So there's a lot of like that kind of world building in a way, but also reconstructing and deconstructing my prior belief.
Yeah, if I may, at one point, it's like, I don't know if this is helpful to you. It's one way is that you don't have to do all of this yourself.
Yeah.
Like I depended on you or even my colleagues here to do the world building of different settings, right?
Yeah.
And of course, then the question becomes like, do you think the way they do it, the sensibilities they have, is matches the kind of questions you want to indulge in? So I think on the one hand, it does sound daunting. Like if I have to do Vietnam, like how do I start? I don't even know the language, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I draw a little bit of comfort and hope this continues for the academy, is that you have enough people keep doing this kind of deep penetrating research with those kind of very textured, fine-grained data, so that if I have to do the kind of world building, which I think is necessary, right? Like even if I do far-right research or extremist research, when I can read the manifestos of, let's say, white power terrorists, I can, because they wrote in English and there's a lot of literature that supports me. But if it's in Arabic, it's going to be a little bit more difficult for me. But I can draw from the kind of very penetrating research of other people and then do the world building. And then, at least when I read Dabiq, which is in English for ISIS, then I can draw from those people and say, know where I situate my research, right? So in the end, it becomes a community question. Like, what kind of community do we want to live in? And again, like I'm always grateful for people like yourself and others who do the world building for me, and then I step into it. It's a bit of cheating, but I thought it holds us together as a community. I hope, yeah.
I think that's an interesting take and a good segue to this second form of reflection, which is this interventions to establish theories, right? And because as a scholars, usually that's how we start, or being trained to start, this very Hegelian dialectic approach of form your thesis and then find an antithesis, and that's synthesis, right? And then as a result, usually supervisor would kind of tell us to, hey, find a gap in theoretical debates, find a gap in the established literature. But sometimes, often, the problem is that the established literature are very Western. And therefore, sometimes it's not necessarily rewarding to do that. Is that how you feel as well? Like, when studying Southeast Asia, is starting with Western theories is the only way to go? Or is there a more rewarding way to do it?
Yeah, I'm gonna draw on personal reflections on this, if you don't mind. This is quite a pertinent question because I had a friend kind of who was co-supervising a student in Southeast Asia, kind of complained to me like he's having this tension with the co-supervisor, where the co-supervisor really wanted to do the so-called Western theory gap thing, whereby you have to identify the gap and then you design your research based on it, and then there's a very clean starting point and cutoff point. And he, knowing the student, thought that the student has this universe of data with him already, and thought that the best way to approach this is to have a narrative and then kind of plan it out and then engage with the theories as you go. In this very specific case, I have a preference, but on a more generic sense, my answer would be a bit more ambivalent. But I do get your point. I think I do find starting with the canon to some extent is a bit not so rewarding. But at the same time, you can't ditch the literature, right? It tells you the treaded grounds and tells you what, at least it convinces you that there's something worth doing there. So I guess my broader point is that while one does have to engage with literature, because I don't think insularity is a good thing in scholarship, is that one has to recognize that we are social scientists, we study the social world, and the social world is not just academia. I often find that if one goes into this thing, like if the theories didn't talk about it, then it's probably not worth talking, to be a little bit insular and aloof. And as I said, it's often not very good for scholarship, and it often results in us being very reactive. Like you always have to play catch up because you kind of miss a lot of stuff, and then something huge happens, like the Trump, and then it's like, oh, we have to kind of reorient it, or security study, we have to go into terrorism studies now because we miss stuff. But if you start with a more grounded sensibility of what is worth reading, then perhaps you don't have to play catch up that often. It's what I would say.
And in a way,
what's your sense of it like?
I agree that there's a lot of value, right? Because it gives you a way to think. Sometimes I found writing in response of something quite stimulating. But obviously, generally as an English scholar, right, the first thing that we did, or I do, is just butcher how or tell people how wrong Kenneth Walsh is, right? Neorealist, wrong in that sense, right? When I wrote my Malaysia piece, for example, that was also the starting point on how, sure, there is this similar assumptions about security dilemma. There is this thinking about actions, reaction, and how it is interdependence. But then for Malaysia, the logic is not zero-sum because they want to make sure their relationship with other countries remain preserved. They want to generate security from those relationships around them. They want, and therefore, they don't necessarily come to their security by zero-sum approach. If China wants to use their water, this Chinese Coast Guard wanted to be in their EEZ for mostly almost permanently, right? Almost a near permanent presence, as long as their economic security, like their ability to exploit oil in the South China Sea, remain protected, why not, right? So they started like thinking about, well, there's a relationship with China that we need to think about, but then the most importantly, I still can get money and get prosperity from these oil explorations, right? So in a way, there is that kind of very different way of thinking about it. So, and writing in response to neorealism helped me get to that point.
Yeah.
But then again, there's also sometimes that very limiting feeling like, oh, should I really write in response to Kenneth Walls? Can I write because I'm interested or I'm finding gaps in the empirics, right?
Yeah.
So when you're sitting on top of universe of data, it's starting from empirical exploration to find gaps possible in research.
Yes, and it depends on what are the kind of gaps you're looking for, right? Like there are explanatory gaps, like things you can't explain, at least from the literature, and there's empirical gaps, like you saw there's this very successful campaign of that basically produced certain kind of outcomes, and you want to ask the questions of how did they do it. So that becomes the empirical and also explanatory gap, but the empirical sort of sits more in the center. I don't think trying to kind of notice these kind of gaps, like the case you mentioned to me just now, the why Malaysia kind of endure that kind of presence there. I think someone else could easily get through that without going through neorealism. It's like they could realize, like, okay, everyone's trying to explain these things, but I find none of them quite satisfying. Then I'll do my research and do it. But then it comes to a different set of questions. It's connected, but sometimes not the research and the writing part. Sometimes, like, if you have a foil, if you can contain your writing, and if someone provides that foil for you to kind of bounce off stuff, then your writing is more coherent, systematic, and perhaps has a greater audience. So those are the kind of considerations, and one could work with them. And then there's a lot of politics of it because, like you say, the East-West unbalance and all those kind of stuff. But to come back to the very fundamental questions, I don't often think that this very stereotypical process, I do the Google Scholar and then I go to libraries and then I find like this is the theoretical gap. And let me think, what can I do about it? I think on a very human level, that's not often how people come to their research puzzles to begin with. Although that's how they write. We can talk about whether that's a good way or bad way. I think there are trade-offs. If one gets too insular, it's like I don't care about what other people say. I just have this thing that I feel that's kind of intimately interesting to me, and I'm just gonna write that way. Probably that's not good, because I always thought that insularity is often bad for, and then that's why people criticize Eurocentrism, right? It's always bad scholarship. But at the same time, if you become a captive audience to the academy and feel like this is the social world that matters to me, I sometimes find that it's a little bit aloof. Right?
Definitely. Yeah. But sometimes the other limitation that comes from that kind of approach is also the kind of data that we need to have, right? Because a lot of scholars corroborate that they're finding in a certain way, and somehow we need to do the same, and therefore very limiting in the methodology. Like in your in your ontological security piece, for example, you use narrative and CVE materials, and you said, sure, this is mundane, but then it actually like it's actually lead us to broader and bigger insights on how they embodied and manifest the world, right? But then if you're not Malaysian, you don't know that that piece is important, perhaps. If I can use that example. Is that how you find as well when you conceptualize that piece? What leads you to use that? This data, this piece of data is actually a very good example to show their world, the way they think.
Foreign policy analysis piece, that piece was actually trying to deal with the question of what is this discourse of moderate Islam for? Yeah. And I argue that it's part of an ontological security seeking practice. Because my kind of cutting in point is that, sure, they say a lot of these kind of stuff. And then there's this predominant way of interpreting is like it's just soft power. They say it because people want to listen to it, and then they use it to cover up their so-called authoritarian practices. My point is that, and then maybe this is where the immersion comes in, like, because I not only track it when they say it in the UN, I track it when they say it on the local ground in Malay, and how they float into the kind of actually operating manuals for local CV practices. Then I thought, like, yeah, it means something because they do it, and of course I do get your point. Then like from certain vantage point, it was like, are we going too micro? Like these are just very mundane stuff. But then I always thought, and I hope people can kind of agree with me. If they can't, then there's nothing I can do about it. Is that if you're really interested in CVE, isn't these are the theaters where CVE gets operationalized? If you don't read this kind of stuff, then what are you reading, right?
Yeah.
So I operate with that kind of leap of faith rather than thinking through it on a more strategic ground. Perhaps for some people that's not very good for your so-called career planning, but it comes very intuitive to me because, like, these are the things that matter, right? That's how I think about it. And then I try to put an explanatory account as to why I think they matter and why people should at least think about it this way as one ways among different ways of thinking about it. But I don't know, like, what are your thoughts about these more granular data stuff vis-a-vis this kind of imperative to write on a more theoretical level?
Yeah. Well, sometimes I like to get accused of over intellectualizing certain things because I'm quite, and this is also related to your questions on whether studying a country or a case purely because of personal interest wrong, right? And sometimes I'm quite interested and quite like understanding things from a phrase, a phrasal, or unpacking a sentence and how the sentence carries quite a lot of, like, for example, in Malaysia case, jangan bikin hal, like, do not blow up things out of proportions, right? And things like that. So yeah, in a way, there's that kind of fear of over intellectualizing this thing, but then I felt like it's very intuitive to me, and there's a lot of richness as long as I'm careful to do that, to kind of use that as an example to challenge and to generate analysis from.
Yeah, I mean the personal interest question, I think sometimes the personal gets over stigmatized. Like it's say that if it's personal interest, it's probably too small, you're probably too biased. But I always thought having personal interest, meaning having prior connections, prior knowledge, and prior stakes, that comes with the research question. And I think if anyone who has done meaningful research like yourself would know that research barriers are often quite high, especially if you want to do that kind of long-term theoretically meaningful or empirically meaningful research. So having those things that flow from personal interest is not a bad thing. At least that's what I thought. And I sometimes think that stakes, sometimes people say that it's bad and you get too connected. But then let's say if you're a kind of ethnic or sexual minority living in a country where there's this kind of majoritarian authoritarianism that goes on, right? Then you feel the stakes, right? Then you're motivated to study it. But you're motivated to study it because you experience it on a very human level, right? Is that a bad thing? I don't think so. But I guess while having this kind of personal stake, I don't think it did necessarily limit your theoretical horizons. Like eventually, if you read the interconnectedness, not just between different levels of analysis, but also between different geographies, like countries are situated in broader webs of stuff, or even a city is situated in broader webs of stuff, then eventually you just grow your personal interest and work on bigger things and hopefully get into places where the personal exposure is less, and then you have to work on that if you have the space and resources. But I think it gives you sure footing, but just don't stay there too long, I guess.
Definitely. it segued to the next form of reflection that I kind of want to briefly explore before we talk about generating conceptual insights, is doubt, right? In fact, for a scholar like Descartes, which is a critic to Hegel and Karl Popper, that is the ultimate way for you to start writing or start doing your research, is to eliminate any belief that could be false, right? Therefore, you arrive at something that is indubitable, right? Like something true, because you've already falsified the rest. But I think that the fundamental question is basically, and this is also things that my supervisor keep asking me at the start of my PhD, was, when approaching data, how do we know when we are wrong? and therefore we know that we are right. Is there a particular approach that you like to do when thinking about verifying your findings?
Yeah, I think having a sense that when you are wrong is quite important. But what is particularly challenging is to know for sure that you're right. Let's say the study of, let's say my case of studying Islam in counterterrorism in Malaysia. I think I have to at least have a mindset to know that if Islam doesn't matter, I should be able to know, right? Like for example, let's say some of these institutions are not involved, some of these religious actors are not involved. If they're not involved completely, like they're just kind of shouting from the sidelines, I should be able to like, hang on here. Maybe you're starting with a kind of not so concrete research puzzle. But how do you know that you approximate, I wouldn't say you're right, you approximate social reality to some extent? I think that is the difficult question. I guess it only comes to me, and maybe this is the more inductive approach, if not a more interpretive approach, is that the reasoning comes through the writing, then, and it also comes through peers challenging you, and I guess that's why peer review is so important in our field. So they are not, at least this is where it comes back to the whole, do you start with trying to challenge your theory or find theoretical gap thing? I often did not start with that very precise mindset. It's like, I'm going to say why this is wrong, and then this is my only contribution. So then I get to be more immersive in the universe of data I have, and then try to make sense of it while I write and then reason, and at the same time kind of engage with the broader theoretical debates. So falsification is part of the process, but to get to this process where I'm pretty sure that I have a little bit of contribution here, is where for me it has to take time and support and reflection, maybe. I suppose that's also things that I believe and I found, because just because I can show that I'm not wrong, it doesn't mean I'm right. I don't know if that makes sense, because is that how you experience it as well? There's a lot of questions that we talk about just now about finding social patterns, right? But I guess at the same time there's a more meta theoretical question that's like, what are social patterns? Like, do we think that things are just gonna go on repeating, or that in as social beings we do break patterns sometimes, and what do we do about that? I guess, but it all depends on the research puzzle you have and the kind of theoretical ambition or theoretical scope you kind of set out for yourself. So I often, and this is again is going a little bit meta, is to think about, and then it comes back to those questions: are they making it up as they go along, or is it self-interest that's situated like way smaller than national interest, all those kind of stuff? So there's often a question of understanding that, on the one hand, that we can see a lot of things and have come to some kind of pattern understanding of social behavior, but at the same time I also often work with the assumption that social behaviors are pattern, but sometimes they break patterns. And then how does one think about that? I guess that enables me to have a more rich understanding of social agents, if I may put it that way. So that's how I think about it. So I don't always press my point to the knife edge saying that this is the pattern. If like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 variables remains constant, I see no reasons for breaking it, because there's often continuity and change that happens in the social world. And that's why I often work with some kind of fluidity, even if I'm making an argument, rather than try to kind of box them in. But then you have to reason it, and that's where the craft of writing and reasoning comes in, I guess.
Definitely, yeah. And it leads to this next point about generating insight. I think both of us, we do like creating framework, but as we talked earlier in different separate discussion, we didn't necessarily start by building framework. We kind of like comes to that kind of after making sense this universe of data and reflecting in a way, right? So in that sense, there are two parts of these questions, right? Like, what was your experience in just thinking about building a framework? But then the other questions that I want to ask is that, given Southeast Asia's diversity and even countries, right? Like Indonesia is so diverse, or Malaysia is so diverse. Is it possible to aim for broader goals? This generalizable pattern beyond that, beyond, is it a good goal to actually creating a framework and theory from Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go to the theoretical framework bit first, and this is my personal, I say, predisposition. When I build those kind of framework, it's more like, it's like a Russian door, but it's not like a Russian door. So the Russian door is like, every time you open something up, it looks similar to the one above, right? For me, it's like, my Russian door is like, if you open up, you see something different in the smaller one, and then you open it up, you see something smaller in the bottom. So that's why I am more, I think sometimes I think that I'm more eclectic than some of my peers, not all. But then the challenge becomes like, how do you still fit all those things in a Russian door? And then it is a Russian door that is interesting to some of the audiences you want to reach, and interesting to the kind of challenges of the contemporary that you want to speak to, right? I mean, China becomes quite intuitive in that sense. In terms of generalizability, I guess one way of thinking about it through an example is James Scott's Weapons of the Weak. So it's sort of a rather contained case study, but it speaks across disciplines and across different research interests, because the findings are so intuitive that it gets easily transmuted into different agendas and interests. But to be able to do that, I think it's more like telling a ghost story. Ghost story tends to be quite culturally specific. I mean, recently you see a renaissance of Indonesian horror, if not Japanese horror. It's very culturally specific. But when it travels, it doesn't stop becoming scary. The question becomes then, can you find that story? Although I don't think that's how one should start research. I want to do this, write this very good ghost story that I can eventually sell to Bollywood and Hollywood and all that. But I think there's certain spots where the generalizability can happen. But it's a social thing. It has to be intuitive socially, that when people read this, it's like, oh yeah, I can do something with this, right?
Yes.
So yeah.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this reflection, and this is Southeast Asia from the ground up. Thank you.
Thank you. I had fun.